Hello and welcome everyone. It is great to have you on board for another instalment of the MLA Productivity and Profitability webinar series. My name is Erica Burnson and I work with the webinar series coordinators aggregate. This series is designed to deliver on topics pertinent to sheep and cattle producers in relation to the productivity and profitability of their business. These webinars are recorded and can be accessed on the MLA website. In tonight's webinar is acidosis in beef cattle on pastures, and will be presented by our guest speaker, Owen Rees, who is a Senior Ruminant Productivity Consultant in South Australia. A bit of housekeeping before we get started. For those who aren't familiar with the webinar program or need a refresh, the control panel you can see to your right is able to be opened and closed using the red arrow so that you can enjoy the full screen during the presentation. Please make sure your questions are as clear as you can have them so that they can be addressed with relevant responses. When you log out of the webinar, a survey will pop up for you to fill out. I would encourage you all to take the time to fill this out. The feedback we receive from this survey is important to the continuation of this webinar series, as it allows us to assess whether we are hitting the right topics for you, the audience. So let's kick off the webinar for today. Tonight's presenter is Owen. He is the Senior Ruminant Productivity Consultant for Total Result Ag Consulting. His role is to help sheep and beef clients increase production and profitability by getting the best nutritional outcomes for their animals. Owen is the third generation to farm his family mixed enterprise property in southwest Victoria, where they run wool, prime lamb and beef cattle. Owen has been a past president of the Australian Association of Ruminant Nutrition, whilst being in the ruminant nutrition industry for over 15 years. We are fortunate to have someone with so much expertise in this area presenting tonight. So with that, I'm hoping to be able to switch over to you, Owen, if you are ready. Hello, Owen.
Hopefully that, yep, going to work there, Erica.
Beautiful.
So beautiful. You can see my screen.
Yep, I can see it. Hopefully everyone else can too. Brilliant.
Cool. All right. Thank you again for allowing us to get in front of all the producers tonight and have a look at something that's probably a little bit different to what most people sort of think about when they think about acidosis, and particularly from the pasture side of things. So if we look from acidosis from a vet's perspective, we're looking at acute acidosis, which is a lactic acid build-up in the rumen. You know, it's where the pH is well below 4.9, and it's where these animals are, let's face it, really quite sick and have a difficult road to recovery. We normally see that, you know, associated with cattle in beef feedlots and things like that, where there's high grain intakes and low forage and fibre. But if we look at nutrition, you know, from a nutrition perspective, acidosis, we look into the realm of what's called subacute ruminal acidosis. And just to make things a little bit easier, we'll probably keep referring to that as SARA. So what is that? It's accumulation of volatile fatty acids, VFA, in the rumen. So we'll delve into that a little bit more as we go into it this evening. But what it is SARA is a chronic condition that animals can recover from. It is, the pH is, you know, a little bit higher than what we see in the acute acidosis area of, you know, sort of the mid fives, and it's a rumen dysfunction. It's where that rumen really isn't performing to its best. So, you know, we get some quotes from guys like Matti Wagner in Canada that says that, you know, SARA in dairy cows. Unfortunately, a lot of the data that we get comes from the dairy industry. That there's from the lit reviews that I've done, into SARA in beef cattle. It's quite few and far between. So most of the data comes out of dairy animals. They're showing that a lactic acid build-up in the rumen is rarely the cause of the total cause of the depression of the rumen pH. But SARA results in excessive volatile fatty acid production that basically exceeds the ability for the animal to absorb all the nutrients that it's getting from their food. Just another scientific quote from Gill in '86. Although lactic acid is clearly involved in acute acidosis, it's not likely common contributors to subacute ruminal acidosis. And another one just that we saw, once again, this is dairy-based, but it's dairy-based out of New Zealand where there's not much concentrate fed and basically a lot of grass. A lower rumen pH was associated with the high total and individual volatile fatty acid concentration. So this was a big one. It was through 121 treatments and through fresh countries, all on fresh pasture. So what we see is this is the range of the pH in the gut, and by all means, don't get overwhelmed by it all. We'll all try and put it back into terms that make sense to a lot of people. But basically, the pH of a cow's rumen is below 7, below neutral, which basically means that when the pH is high, up in the 6s, it's very safe. Those animals have a very safe rumen, but it's suboptimal. We're not getting that much production out of those. And as we load these animals up, we get into what is called the SARA range, which is again the subacute ruminal acidosis in that sort of mid-5s and a little bit higher pH. Now, we have to remember that pH is a log scale. So between 6 and 5, the pH 5 is actually 10 times worse than the rumen pH of 6. So as we keep going down this scale, the acidity in this rumen is building up to the point where we get clinical acidosis, which is, again, where we started this evening, on where vets sort of work in that lactic acid production. These are the animals that really do struggle to get better, and it's mainly sort of seen in high grain feeding areas. So what is SARA? What it actually is, it's an accumulation of volatile fatty acids. Again, we'll get into what actual volatile fatty acids are. It's the dropping of the pH, which is disturbing the gut-backed microbes, and it has a huge impact on fiber digestion. It's an imbalance of the production of the volatile fatty acids in the rumen, and the ability for that animal to get these volatile fatty acids out of the rumen and into the bloodstream, where it can actually be used to create the animal's energy. So basically, we're getting a point of too much of a good thing, it isn't helping these animals. So if we take a step backwards and we have a little bit of a think, about our cattle, they're ruminants, so that they've got basically a fermentation vat in their stomach that actually the foods, once they eat their foods and chew them up, they're available for microbial fermentation in these big fermentation vat known as the rumen. So we need to have the best conditions known that we can get the maximum microbial benefit out of the food that we're giving these animals. Enzymes that are needed for the breakdown of food don't exist in the rumen, but the bugs can actually make these enzymes. So we need that the health of these microbial population is quite pivotal. So if you have a look at the little photo there, I'm not sure if you can see my arrow, but if you have a look at the little photo there, this is the actual inside of a rumen. These have got papillae on the inside of the rumen to increase surface area. So if you have a look at your hands and you look at your palm of your hand, there's not a lot of skin surface area on the palm of your hand. But if you have a look at the skin that's around all your fingers, you finally start to sort of see that there's a lot more surface area of skin around your fingers. And this is basically what these papillae are doing inside the rumen. They're giving these the rumen wall a lot more surface area for all these nutrients to be absorbed across. So as we said, you know, this is the rumen is a fermentation vat. And if you ever get a chance to have a look in a fistulated animal or an animal that's got a plug in it to actually see the inside of a rumen, it's quite interesting to have a look at. So when the food comes down into the esophagus, it comes down, and at some stage the animals will bring that food back up, rechew it and swallow it, and it'll come down and it'll form into, if it is fibre, it'll form into this rumen mat or rumen raft that floats on the top of all the liquid that's in the rumen. And what we hope is that these animals then regurgitate this mat, rechew it, and keep breaking it down until it just starts to sit in the solution below. And the rumen being such a big mixing tank of itself, the rumen contracts and pushes all this liquid back over through all of our mat, and actually getting these microbes out of the solution and the solution to actually sit back up into the mat, and which gives the bacteria more time to digest the food. When you think about it, you've got to think that there's the amount of bugs that are in a rumen is ridiculous. You know, for every 1 ml of rumen fluid, there is 100 billion bacteria. So if you think of how many bugs there are in a cow's rumen at any one time, there is a hell of a lot of zeros behind the amount of bugs that are sitting in the cow's rumen. So it's just showing that the more bugs that we have, we're dealing with these bugs that are breaking down the food to actually be able to feed the cow. You know, if you think of the analogy that basically these bugs are in the car, they're driving the car. It's like these bugs are in the cow's gut, and they're actually driving the cow to go eat the food, to eat the grass, because they're breaking that food down on her behalf. And then these little bugs are then feeding the cow what they're getting. So as I said, it's a process. So basically, once the roughage or the fibre or the grass goes in through the esophagus, it comes down. Some of it will be degraded in one big hit into the rumen fluid, so it'll be very quite soluble. So if you think of things like you know, leafy grasses or brassica crops or things like that, a lot of that is very, very soluble. A lot of that stuff turns to lettuce soup quite quickly. There's not much roughage or effective fibre that's actually there that will need to be fermented. So that in itself can lead to some issues, and we'll look at that a little bit further on. But if you think as this food gets degraded by these bugs through the process of fermentation, the bugs then release what's called our volatile fatty acids, which we discussed at the start, and also the bugs themselves dying actually feed the animal what's called microbial protein, and it's a really good amino acid profile for our animals to put on weight and things like that as well. So really, we want to feed these bugs because the bugs feed the cow, and then the bugs, after they've done their process and start to die, continue to feed the cow as well with their dead bodies. So we talk about this volatile fatty acid that comes from all these animals digesting the feed, but how does it get out of the rumen? You know, as I said, we've got a rumen wall that's only so big. They grow these lovely healthy papillae, which are these dark ones you see here to my left on the screen, and they're showing that they're lush and long, and they're actually trying to suck out as much volatile fatty acids as they can out of the rumen, because the longer that they stay in the rumen, that volatile fatty acid, and you know, with the word acid attached to it, it's actually showing that it will drop the pH in that rumen. What you can see from the other part of the slide is you can start to see, you know, pretty healthy papillae. And then what starts to happen is when that acid stays for quite a while, that acid will actually start to attack the papillae, you know, start to break them down. We'll get sloughing and we'll actually start to do damage. And the biggest thing, and we don't want to go into too much chemistry, but the biggest problem that we have is that as more and more volatile fatty acids are produced and sit in the rumen, we can actually get to the point where the rumen is more osmotic charged than the blood, and we can actually get water that runs from the blood into the rumen and actually bursts these papillae, basically keratinizes these papillae, so blows all these great surface areas off, and basically you lose a lot of ability for that animal to absorb its nutrients. So, you know, hopefully we haven't sort of bored you with the science behind SARA yet. Look, hold it with me. We will sort of try and understand a little bit more what this means to farmers and to the beef cow. But basically what we're sort of seeing from all this, you know, energy, volatile fatty acids that these bugs are producing is, you know, the more digestible something is, the easier it is for these bugs to break down, the higher the amount of energy that comes out of them. So if you think of, you know, as I said, your leafy grasses, your leafy crops, you know, things like turnips that are really got a lot of starch and things like that in there, they're broken down really at huge digestibility, high digestibility rates. And this puts a big load on these animals to try and absorb all these nutrients, all these volatile fatty acids in the rumen that are hitting the rumen quite quickly. We also have a look at things that have got high water soluble content, you know, so we look at things like that have got, you know, beets, or a few years ago there was a lot of grasses being sold as being high sugar grasses. The problem with these types of pasture species is as soon as they hit that rumen liquor, they basically disintegrate into very simple sugars, and that goes. These bugs convert this into a volatile fatty acid called butyrate. The biggest problem with butyrate is the more butyrate we get into the rumen, the less the rumen wants to contract and mix. So you know, it does have an effect on our rumen. The other thing, in times when we don't have large amounts of pasture, we also like to supplement it. In a lot of areas, we like to supplement them with silage. You know, silage, once again, is a fermented feed, so it's generally has a, you know, a lower pH. So when we're putting this silage into our cows, we're giving the pH a head start by actually adding a feedstuff in that's got a very low pH as well. So this energy source, or this volatile fatty acids, half of it is actually in the bugs themselves. The bugs have digested it, or a third of it, sorry, the bugs have digested and it's in their bodies. But we've still got 2/3 of this energy source that we've got to either transport through the rumen wall, so we've got to suck it through those finger-like structures on the inside of the rumen and get it into the blood, where it can be taken off and actually turned into energy, which is, you know, turned into the ability for those animals to walk, you know, breathe, and reproduce, but also for those animals to put on muscle and you know, create fetuses and things like that. So we've got to be able to get this energy out of that rumen and into the blood. We do have issues, obviously, as we've talked about, with surface area when we don't have enough of these finger-like structures or these papillae. And that basically happens in cases where people have confined animals, you know, when the break's been late, and we've confined animals onto a roughage diet, and we've waited for our grass to grow, and it's finally there, and we turf these cows from a roughage diet out into this really lush grass. These cows eat the really lush grass. We've got this fantastic feed source that's very, very soluble. But the problem is that animal's rumen isn't adapted to that feed source, so it's really got an inability to drag that VFA out of that rumen, put into the blood and take it away and actually turn energy into it. So, you know, that one's a big one when you're changing diets, is to make sure you try and do it, you know, slowly, so these animals have the ability to acclimatise their rumen to the feed source that they're going on to. And also, you know, the volatile fatty acids need to have that ability to get to the extremities of the rumen, get out of that rumen liquid, get out towards that rumen wall where they can be absorbed through, across the gradient, the osmotic gradient in the rumen. But without the effective fiber and without that rumen mixing, those volatile fatty acids don't get right out to the extremities. So as you can see, this is from one of our clients' data on some animals that were actually culled, and their rumens were scored after being processed. And we can actually see here on my left, if you think on the extremities here, we can see these papillae structures being lush and thick and brown, which means they're full of blood vessels, so great at sucking these volatile fatty acids out. And in the middle here, you can see where we've had some scarring. We've had some acid load sit against that rumen wall from one period or another, and it's actually got to the point where it's burnt these finger-like structures off. We've gone from having these lush amounts of surface area right to the point where we're now back to similar surface area of the palm of our hand. Cow 2 has some rumen scarring, but is nowhere near as bad as cow 4. Now, the problem with scarring on the rumen is it tends to not grow these finger-like structures, the papillae back. So we do get to the point where a lot of rumen scarring will actually impede the animal's ability to transport energy source from their food into the blood that they can use further on. So, the other thing people always talk about, well, is if we can't get it out of the rumen, is there any way that we can actually buffer this solution in the rumen so these acid load isn't as challenging for the animals? So, the diets may have some issues with buffering and things like that, depending on, other ions, so potassium load and chloride load, and the nitrogen, from the grass as well can have an effect on that animals and its ability to buffer. But also the biggest one that we see is the limitation of effective NDF. So that is basically the fiber or the forage that the animal has to eat and has to chew to chew it once, it forms that great rumen mat that we talked about. They bring it back up again, and they try and physically or mechanically break that fiber down into smaller particles so it's easier for the bugs to attack and to get the nutrients out of it. While the animal is doing this, she's creating what's called endogenous bicarb. It's a buffering effect that she has in her saliva. The more that she chews on this forage or this fiber source, the more saliva she produces and the more bicarb that is in this saliva. So when that gets swallowed and goes down into the rumen, obviously the bicarb has an ability to buffer a little bit of this acid that is in the rumen and probably help things try and increase the pH in this rumen up into the area where we're not starting to hurt our animals. There also has an environmental effect. In hot weather, animals do salivate less, and they spend a lot of time, especially when they're really hot, with their mouths open mouth breathing. And unfortunately, this can also have an effect on the amount of bicarb that they produce when they're doing that. So what does this SAR in turn produce? So what happens when these animals hit this suboptimal rumen dysfunction? When this rumen it's still doing its thing, but it's just not doing it as well as it could do. Well, we have reduced organic matter and fiber digestibility. Really, in most of the time when we're dealing with feeds and the fermentation and the processing of feed, reduction is never a good thing. Reduced feed conversion efficiency. So we end up feeding these animals the same amount of feed that we did the day before when everything was going well, and then these animals just don't convert it, whether it be into saleable meat or milk to feed their offspring or anything like that. We get a loose manure. We get a lower milk yield, but also, which is exacerbates it, I suppose you could say too, is we get lower milk solid content in the milk yield. So when the beef cow is feeding her calf, she gets the calf gets less amount of milk, but it also doesn't have the same amount of solids in there. So those calves just can't get the head start that they really need to. But the other big thing is we get reduced reproductive efficiency just because these animals don't have the absorbable energy source from the VFAs going through that rumen wall into the blood, and therefore putting these animals in a lot better reproductive state. So just to sort of show that I'm not making all this up, this is a study by Bill Wales in 2004. This is one on perennial ryegrass, but what it basically shows is, if you look here, hopefully you can see my cursor, my pointer, at a pH which is 5.6. So we're into this, what we've been discussing, into this SARA range, the subacute ruminal acidosis, versus what is called, probably a better pH, a little bit higher, around that 6.1. When we look at organic matter or true digestibility, we notice that from this pH in this rumen that is lower, which is showing the rumen has dysfunction, we've got a 15% difference in the amount that rumen fluid will actually digest. We take it down that next column and we find out that the fibre digestibility, the neutral detergent fibre, has a difference of 30%. Now, let's try and sort of think of that in the terms of that every bale of hay that you put out into the paddock, 30% of that, basically the animals, passes the animals 100% and just ends out in the manure. 30% difference. That's a huge amount of feed that we're putting down the animal's throat, and that animal isn't seeing any benefit whatsoever. I think that one's really sort of shows that we've got to remember, these animals still aren't visually sick. We're not calling the vet to try and help us with these animals. These animals are just not running on all 8 cylinders. Once again, this is a New Zealand dairy study, but it basically shows that the digestion of forage decreases, in mixed forage at 6 to 6.2. On highly digestible ryegrasses, we actually see, that the NDF, digestibility doesn't start to change until it drops below 5.8. We've got to remember, at the pH 5.8, we're still in this SARA range. We're not in the acute range where we actually start to see, visual effects in the animals. So, as I said, what are some of the other effects of having a lower pH? As you can see, and as we've discussed, we get higher levels of our butyrate, which means that instead of, mixing, say, at 3 times a minute in the rumen, we get low, below 1.5 to 1.7 contractions a minute, which means that, we're not getting these volatile fatty acids, these energy source to the cows, to the outer parts of the rumen. We also have less, absorption through the rumen wall because those bugs aren't there waiting for them. And we also have a reduction in cud chew, that, as we discussed before, that animals' ability to rechew food or a fibre source that they've eaten previously in the day that would then produce endogenous bicarb and actually allow these animals to buffer their own rumen, to try and bring the pH up of their own rumen. And that's just sort of just showing that, remember, we've got our mat that sits in the middle, and we're trying to get this rumen to mix like a cement mixer, and come back, get all this solution to come back up over the top of the mat or into the mat, where it will spend a little bit more time and have a little bit more time to be digested. We go out into the paddock, and what do we see? What what can we sort of see that highlights that these animals are in this subacute ruminal acidosis? Well, the thing is that it's not that easy. We see a lot of animals, that are sitting there doing nothing. When they're resting, these animals aren't chewing their cud. They're not ruminating like they're supposed to, because they don't have this rumen environment that is fantastic. We see a lot of this loose water-like feces on the right-hand side of the screen. We even get to the point where we start to see these bubbles in the manure, and I know walking around a lot of farms at the moment, we are starting to see this, this bubbly manure, which is, showing that this rate of passage, this food is flowing through our rumen too fast before we're actually getting the bugs are getting the total ability to digest it all. As I said, what's happening here, that we've got basically a lot of watery fluid that's showing that we're actually getting more water into the rumen, which could mean that we're actually pulling water out of the blood and putting it into the rumen. We're actually showing that this digestion of this feed has gone out of the rumen, so we're now seeing some of this getting digested in the large intestine, which is generally the site of where the water is supposed to be reabsorbed, so these animals don't have to continuously drink. They're trying to keep a bit of the moisture from their feed in their body, but because it's all happening in the large intestine, it's making it hard for this organ to try and reabsorb the water. We've also get our fermentation continuing in the large intestine, which means that we're getting these volatile fatty acids released, but there's no bugs there to, there's no bugs there to sort of take it. There's no bugs there to use it to grow and then to die and be absorbed further on. So unfortunately, what we see these volatile fatty acids and these carbohydrates released into the manure, where we see these bubbles in the dung. And the biggest problem that we have, and we talk about, previously the acid load and the scarring on the rumen wall, it's even exacerbated even more when things are fermented in the large intestine, because the large intestine is only one cell thick, whereas the rumen is, in some places up to 16 cells thick. So for the scarring to occur in the rumen means that it's really going to be hard on those animals if a lot is starting to be fermented in the large intestines. And that's where we start to see, some mucosal layers and things like that actually get pushed out into the feces as well, that claggy sort of consistency that we sometimes see, or we can even sometimes see the skin itself sloughing off into the manure. And we really know that we're putting a lot of pressure on these animals. So, it's great to, we really, as farmers, we really, want to hold animal welfare at the front of mind, but we're also, we're business people, and we need to understand that how is this suboptimal or this, subacute ruminal acidosis affecting my bottom line? So if we have if we sort of think about a steer that's eating about 10 kilos dry matter of a, 10 ME, 40 NDF pasture, so a fairly normal sort of pasture for this time of the year. But we've put this animal into this SARA range, into this range where she has 30% drop in NDF digestibility. So 30% of that 40% pasture is no longer going to be digested in the animal. It's actually going to be washed out and end up in the manure. So if we calculate that, that would mean that we've got 12 megajoules of this cow's diet that have now been wasted. It doesn't sound a lot, but if we assume that it takes us roughly 38, 42, so we'll call it 40 in the middle, megajoules to put on 1 kilo of live weight gain, that 12 megajoules wasted equates to 333 grams of growth per animal per day. So a third of a kilo is being lost in our animals daily just through suboptimal rumen health. You know, and we start to put some dollar terms behind that. If you were to look at, you know, weaner steer prices at the moment of $7+ a kilo live weight, this would mean that we're looking in the vicinity of, you know, $2.33 per head per day that could be lost through the feed that you're actually feeding these animals, and the growth that they could be achieving if everything was running on all 8 cylinders. You know, you start to calculate that across some of these farms and some of the larger farms, and it starts to actually add up into a lot of dollars that these farmers aren't seeing, but they're also not understanding, because these animals are coming across like everything's right. You know, apart from some animals that aren't ruminating and some animals that are have loose manure, the cows look fine. You know, there's some dirt on their rump and their tails are a little bit shitty, but at the end of the day, they're still functioning like a cow. But instead of running on all 8 cylinders, there's a chance that most of them are running on 6. So that's great. We've now got the background behind this subacute ruminal acidosis, and we're sort of like, well, that's great. You know, we've learned some nutrition, some science tonight, but what can we do on farm that's actually going to help these animals? You know, how do we sort of change things? Well, we look at things like the grazing management. You know, as you can see from this slide, the longer, you know, the grass has to grow, and the longer the grass has in a rest period, the digestibility of that grass actually starts to have a negative effect, to the point where if we leave it way too long, you know, we basically have no, you know, or very little digestibility. But we don't usually get to the point where we're getting out to 25 weeks. What we're actually suggesting is, you know, if we can give these grass just a little bit of a rest time, we can actually get some a better mix of you know, digestible nutrients, and actually have grass that will stay in these cows a little bit longer as well. If you have a look at this slide, it's a little bit busy, but the interesting thing is you know, if you look at the difference between the leaf, you know, like you send a cow into a paddock, you know, that first day she gets into the paddock and all she wants to do is eat the leaf tip, you know, and then you go, well, okay, you know, then the next day she, you know, or the few following days, she's now got to eat the stem. You know, what effect does that have on the cows? And we can see here from the bottom of the arrow that if on this lab pasture, so this is a slide out of the feed evolution unit in New South Wales, what you can actually see is that if these animals were to only eat the leaf tips on this lab pasture, we'd have a dry matter digestibility of 75%. So really quite high. When you compare that to something that's, you know, the stem only at about 56, which is, you know, is a lot more moderate. And if we get the animals to eat the whole plant, we can get them back closer to that sort of 60% dry matter digestibility. So it's all about encouraging those animals to eat a balanced diet, you know, to eat something that's consistent. You know, we speak to our clients a lot of the time about how dull and boring us nutritionists are, because all we're trying to do is get things consistent. You know, we want to have a consistent diet that is very similar to the animals at all times. And yeah, you know, look, that can be quite challenging to try and get things that are consistent, but you know, there are ways and means on a farm that we can, you know, may not be always 100% right, but we can be moving in the right direction. Pasture selection as well. I mean, here's just some stuff on forage crops. As you can see, you know, over this side of the neutral detergent fibre digestibility, there's a huge variation in how potent, how soluble these feed sources are, and how much when they initially get eaten and hit that rumen liquid, how much of it gets turned into lettuce soup. You know, and what we're basically saying is that too much of a good thing doesn't necessarily work out well for our growth rate in our cattle. So, you know, we're looking at a much rounder approach than something that's really going to be very highly fermentable. You know, rocket fuel that's just going to go into these animals, hit the digestion liquor, and basically turn to lettuce soup, and in a lot of cases pass straight out of the cow as well. Yep. So the other thing that we can think of is, you know, effective fibre. You know, we can give these animals a supplementary source of a fibre that's going to help them with salivation. It's going to help them with chewing their cud, and you know, it's going to help that rumen mix and have contractions a lot. You know, at maybe 2.7 to 3 times a minute, so which is going to force a lot of that volatile acid out to the extremities where it can be absorbed across the rumen wall. But also, so that a fibre builds this raft, and it actually holds a lot of the digestion, you know, in the rumen, and probably tries to slow it going out into the large intestines. This one is an interesting slide, but basically what it is showing that how coarse the hay is will affect, once again, unfortunately, it is a dairy slide, but what it shows that how coarse the fibre is meant that the animals actually had better rumen pHs, as you can see between the fine, the medium, and the coarse. We've actually got a higher rumen pH. They didn't eat any more of their diet, but when they were offered, you know, a textured feed, a medium or coarser feed, their rumen pHs were higher. They spent more time eating. Remember, you know, once again, more time eating means that they're chewing, they're producing more saliva, and they spent more time trying to break that fibre down. You know, there's an increase in minutes in that rumination, and as we can see down the bottom, they produced a lot more of their own endogenous bicarb. This isn't bicarb that you buy in the bag at the rural store. This is bicarb that these cows produced from their own diet. So this is 180 grams of bicarb that these cows were able to create themselves to help buffer their own rumen. And as we can see by 6.25 rumen pH, that buffering capacity really did help that rumen get back up to, you know, probably slightly higher, but, you know, optimal condition. Look, this one's also, you know, we don't need to dwell on it, but it also shows the effect that nitrogen has on bacteria. So what it is basically showing, we don't need to get buried down into which bacteria is doing what or anything like that, but what this slide is basically showing is that the more nitrite that we have, the less growth these animals have. So the more nitrogen that is entering the rumen, whether it be in the form of, you know, protein or even nitrogen itself through, you know, heavily nitrified grasses or crops, this is actually having a negative effect on that pH, but also on the bugs themselves. So try and wrap it up for you. I think that's probably, you know, gone into enough of it. Hopefully you guys have got some questions, but, you know, some of the things that I hope, you know, I've sort of portrayed and you guys can take home is that, you know, if we can change our grazing management to make sure the animal eats more of the whole plant, not just the leaf tips. You know, unfortunately, set stocking really does lead those animals to graze the juicy, the sweet little leaves on their favourite block of land. And it just, you know, they really don't have to eat that whole plant as much, whereas rotational or block grazing really does force those animals to eat a lot more of that plant in the one sitting. The old adage that we usually tell a lot of people is you can't change what you don't measure. Go out and test your grass. Yes, it might change daily. Yes, you know, it might change per paddock, but you know, is the grass that these animals that you're having a lot of trouble with, is it really just rocket fuel? Is it really too good? You know, do we need to allow these paddock to have a little bit more rest so these grass can mature a little bit more, so we can have a more balanced diet for these animals? We don't know. We're only surmising it if we don't have some figures in front of us. You know, and as we saw before, when we're starting to lose, you know, 30% of our digestibility of NDF, it doesn't take too long to pay off a forage test to you know, to make that worthwhile to our business. Give the animals access to effective fibre. You know, that helps with our rumen mat, it slows rumen function. The animal chews more, creates more buffer. We have to be a little bit careful though. We can't just try and feed them cardboard, because these animals need to freely accept this fibre source. You know, they have to want to eat the fibre. There's no point dragging out some hay that's been underneath some trees for the last 5 years and pretty much looks like compost, smells like compost, and putting it out in our paddock, because, you know, that should be a good coarse fibre source for these animals. We actually have to have something, you know, like a nice bright barley straw, or some, you know, some sorghum hay, or some ryegrass, you know, hay, or something that these animals are going to want to eat. It's going to force these animals to regurgitate it and to chew their cud, and, you know, help with that endogenous buffering, and just to help slow the whole rate of digestion down as well. And just also, you know, as we just sort of glazed over at the end, just to not make it too hard to follow, but watch the nitrogen levels in your grasses, and your potassium levels as well, because that will have an effect on rumen health and the bug population and that. So just be a little bit careful with how much fertilisation you put on the pastures, and at what time of year you put that out, because obviously that has an effect on the animals that are eating it as well. So as you can see down the bottom, there is my email address. Happy to answer any questions that people don't want to put up, but hopefully we have some questions to go through.
Thank you, Owen. That was really insightful. Thanks for giving us some insight into what we should be looking for to diagnose acidosis in our herds, and what we can do to hopefully prevent it a little more. Before we get some questions, I'm aware that some of you may have to take off early, so I just ask, please, that you fill out the survey as you exit the webinar. This survey is shared with MLA and the presenters to help improve extension efforts and make sure we are targeting topics relevant to you. Oh, yep, we've had a few questions come through. So this was going back, Owen, to when you mentioned loose manure that you might find out in the paddock, and Joanne asked if
Yep.
Would you see blood in the feces as well?
Look, sometimes, you know, blood and things like that has obviously meant that there's been some internal damage in the feces. There is all, you know, which could suggest that we have got a you know, large intestine site of absorption, you know, site of fermentation. There's also some issues with clostridial diseases, and, you know, things like rotavirus and things like that with blood in the feces. So look, I would actually suggest that that's probably past the point of being nutritional, and I'd probably get a vet involved to sort of try and diagnose where that blood is coming from, and if that blood is, you know, is something that's happening to those animals that will end up having an adverse effect.
Yeah, okay, so if you see blood in the feces, it's not necessarily acidosis, is that what you're getting at?
Correct. Yeah. There is other things that would mean that we'd end up in blood in the feces, and, you know, at that stage you're probably better off to you know, engage in a vet to give you some help with that one.
Yep. Alrighty then, thank you. Ben has asked what your thoughts are on green feed mineral licks with buffering.
Look, the hard one is obviously things like mineral licks and things like that are basically there as a quick fix to help those animal get back to a more consistent diet. You know, it's there for something to help a producer really quite quickly that hasn't got the ability to, extend a grazing rotation out, or can't quickly provide some effective fibre to the animals or anything like that. What it does is it nutritionally gives those animals, in most cases, minerals or buffering indexes that will help to drive that pH up, that will help these animals, try and get back into a better ruminal pH. So in short, yeah, they do help, but it's probably one of those things that you use as a quick fix, and then you look at the things that you can do on your own farm yourself that aren't going to cost as much money, that can be done in the long run.
Yep. So would you be able to say, if you notice you can see a bit of subacute acidosis out there, you can put out a lick block and then follow it up with some effective fibre, like some hay bales, for instance? Would that work?
Yeah, look, that's what we sort of look at with with a lot of our guys that we work with is, obviously it's hard without being on everyone's farms to know each farm is obviously individual and different. But if you're seeing some issues, you're looking at a lick or a supplement of some form that's actually going to help with rumen buffering, or it's going to help with trying to slow down the rate of passage through the rumen. And then you'd probably try and work with someone to help you with your grazing strategies and your availability for fibre and things like that as well.
Yeah, right. That clears that up. Thank you very much. Moving on, well, staying actually on the subject of hay, what type of hay is not coarse? And also what about canola hay, says Faye.
Yeah, I mean, look, canola hay is one of those things that it's very hard to generalise on a type, if you will. Like, I've seen some really great canola hay, and I've seen some stuff that looks like baled twigs in a bale. So it's really hard to generalise, with something like that. Once again, we advise all of our clients to buy stuff based on a forage test, so they actually understand what is in it. But we're looking at something that's going to provide a fibre that will float in the rumen and form this rumen mat and will need to be rechewed. So we're looking at things that are quite erect. So obviously if protein is an issue as well, we're looking at things like lucernes. We're looking at straws. Not that I know a lot about obviously the northern cattle areas, but we're also thinking of things like sorghums and plants that are more erect, have got more building block structure of fibre to mean that these animals have got to mechanically break this fibre down, which causes more chewing action. So while we see a lot of canola and things like that, we've just got to be a little bit careful to generalise on a species of plant without actually knowing whether the animals are going to eat it and whether it is too far the wrong way.
Yep. Okay. So on the similar theme, Anna would like to know if having a small amount of weeds, would that be more beneficial because there's more variability in your pasture?
It's one of the things that's getting a little bit more traction around at the moment is this movement away from monoculture pasture, if you will, totally one single species to actually have the ability to have the animal's ability to forage. It's an interesting one. Obviously, some weeds will have an effect and give these animals a little bit more fibre, early on in when this grass is really rapidly growing. The biggest problem that we have is towards the end of the growing season, these plants get quite mature quite quickly. If you have very early heading dates, so they go mature, and then the plants will selectively not consume them, and that's the issue. We generally see this acidosis or this rumen dysfunction through rapidly growing pastures. So through our autumn, winter, early spring periods, we don't see as much until we get to pasture crops, the acidosis or the SARA on grasses that are going reproductive. So while it might help at the start, of this this event, this seasonal event, it may actually, come back to bite us in the bum a little bit further on when these grasses do tend to go reproductive a lot earlier.
Yeah. Okay then. On the theme of silage, Anne would like to know, because she said that you mentioned that silage may increase the chances of SARA occurring, but would this depend on the type of silage? Example, oats and vetch that has a lot more stem than straight ryegrass silage.
Yeah, cool. Great question. The biggest thing that once again, it's not so much the species. It's not a Holden or Ford battle, if you will, or it's basically what we're seeing is silages that high moisture silage that tends to ferment really quite quickly in a silage pit and reach really low pHs. We tend to then, when we feed these animals the silage, we're feeding them really low pH feed. So when that feed hits the rumen, we're exacerbating that pH effect that we're already seeing in the rumen. So it's not so much in that instance, it's not so much, say, oat silage versus ryegrass silage. It's more the silage that was probably cut really quite wet and has had an unoptimal fermentation that's got a really low pH that we need to watch. But generally speaking, both oats or grazing crops and ryegrass can make as good a silage or as poor a silage depending on how it's done. So, that one probably has a bit more of effect on the ensiling program of the silage than the types of grasses that they go into them.
Yeah, okay, so it's more to do with the process of making the silage rather than what's in it.
Exactly, yeah, for sure.
Okay, still on the silage theme, but slightly off course. Daniel is saying, if I'm seeing very runny poos with bubbles, can I sprinkle bicarb on the silage before the animals eat it?
Yes, you can, Daniel. I mean, if that makes you feel better, like it's going to help. But I mean, how much bicarb are you going to sprinkle? And I mean, if you think of that slide with the Bill Wales work no, it wasn't Bill Wales. It was another person on endogenous bicarb. To get up to a pH of above SARA with that coarse hay, when we looked at hay types, these animals are producing 160 grams of bicarb extra just by chewing their cuds more. So unless we're going out there with a fronty loader amount of bicarb for our animals, we're probably not going to be able to have enough bicarb to actually really drive the pH of these rumens up, and we'd probably be better off to, if that is the case, that we probably need to either provide these animals with a slightly coarser feed, like a hay or a straw or something like that to make these animals ruminate and to chew their cud than what we are to supply them with, generally speaking, 60 to 80 grams of bicarb that most people would feed their animals.
Yeah, thank you for that. That will hopefully answer your question, Rosalind, of how effective is loose-lick bicarb in helping prevent SARA. I guess the answer's not particularly well.
Yeah, look, yeah, pretty much the same. And unless these things are going to eat it, and let's face it, if they eat that amount, they're probably going to start to affect your bottom line. If they're eating that much bicarb, it's going to be quite costly.
Yep. Anna wondered, do internal parasites contribute to SARA?
They would have a slight effect in the sense that they may affect the rumen wall, but from all that I have seen, a lot of internal parasites, and I'm sort of thinking of worms when we're talking internal parasites, are actually further down the digestive tract than the rumen. You know, they're in the intestines. They're in for sucking bloods and stuff like that, because if you know the worms are further down, and it's quite a harsh environment to be in the rumen. So we generally seem to find that they sit into those the intestinal tracts a lot more than we do the rumen. So why they may have a slight effect, I don't think it would be a huge problem.
Yeah, so they're not a major contributing factor at all. Okay.
No.
Daniel also asked, once the rumen is damaged, because you showed us those rumen scars, will it heal over time, or is that it stuffed, basically?
Unfortunately not, and you know, it's a bit like when you get a scar yourself. You know, that tissue does tend to harden up, and you know, we find it hard to sweat through and things like that. You know, there was you know, a lot of people that have, say, tattoos actually do get overheated because of the scarring of their skin don't actually allow them to sweat out through their skin. So the scarring, you know, in that case of a tattoo is very similar to a cow's rumen, where that papillae has been scarred. It won't regenerate to that papillae structure, and we will lose capacity for that feed to go out of the rumen into the blood.
Okay, I did not realise that. There we go. You learn something new every day. And I think our final question is from Karina, and she wonders, how long would you leave the animals in the paddock?
Okay, that one's a little bit open, Karina. The biggest problem is obviously when the animals overgraze a paddock, it does affect the pasture's ability to regenerate. So, you know, we like to, with our customers and things like that, we like to get our pre-grazing heights of, say, our ryegrasses, you know, around about the 3,000 tonne or 3,000 kilos, of dry matter per hectare, and we like to graze them down at this time of the year to about 1,600 kilos of dry matter of pasture, just to know that animal basically has taken off, you know, 2/3 of the available grass, so that the ryegrass plant has still got one or a half leaf back to make sure it's got enough solar panels to, you know, photosynthesize to harvest the sunlight and turn it back into sugars and to continuously grow for the next grazing. So you know, we like to take as much off as that we can, but we also like to sort of, you know, we understand that those plants have got to have a solar panel to be able to regenerate themselves moving forward. Okay, I think that's a pretty good summary tonight. There are no more questions, so I guess we'll be able to call it an evening. Thank you very much, Owen. That was absolutely very insightful, and we all really enjoyed it. I know I did anyway. No, thank you for the opportunity. It's been a great discussion, and hopefully the producers and people involved get a bit out of it. And as I said, if they've got any questions, feel free to email them through to me.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for tuning in tonight. And as you leave, please take time to fill out the survey. Thank you very much.